Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Martin had never been the kind of man to let go of a grudge easily. Beneath the polished exterior and polite smile he presented to the world, there had always been a storm brewing quietly, fed by betrayal, loss, and unresolved bitterness. Ever since his relationship with Lucy collapsed, he had carried within him a wound so deep and so personal that even time couldn't dull its sting. But what made that wound fester was not just heartbreak. It was the gnawing suspicion that their downfall had been orchestrated by someone else, someone far more dangerous than either of them had initially suspected. That someone was Tracy. The animosity between Tracy and Lucy was never subtle. Their clashes at General Hospital were legendary, battles over funding, influence, public image, and power. Lucy, once in charge of a prominent medical foundation, had fought tooth and nail for control over her projects, only to find herself undermined at every turn. What she didn't realize until it was too late was that Tracy had been maneuvering in the shadows, seeding distrust and sabotage that eventually unraveled Lucy's standing and, by extension, her relationship with Martin. It wasn't just professional sabotage. It was personal. Martin saw it clearly now. Tracy had manipulated the situation, whispering poison into the right ears, ensuring Lucy would walk away from him with a broken heart and no answers. For months, Martin had nursed his pain in silence, watching from afar as Lucy and Tracy's feud escalated. He had accepted that his time with Lucy was over, but what he couldn't accept was how Tracy had emerged unscathed, as calculating and untouchable as ever. He needed something, anything. To tip the balance of power, to restore a sense of justice for the chaos she had left in her wake. Then, one rainy afternoon while helping Drew sort through old paperwork from his estate, Martin stumbled upon it, a letter, yellowed with age, wedged between stacks of legal documents. It had no return address, no indication of who had sent it, only a neatly written initial and a date that corresponded with a period of great unrest at General Hospital. Martin's curiosity got the better of him, and when he opened the letter, what he found left him breathless. Carefully penned confessions described systemic corruption within the hospital's board, backroom deals, and intentional cover-ups of patient deaths. The details were too specific to be fiction. And worse yet, the name, Tracy, was scrawled repeatedly alongside evidence of her alleged orchestration of one patient's death being reclassified to protect financial interests. Monica, then a senior member of the board, had apparently signed off on the documentation, perhaps unknowingly, perhaps not. Martin realized in an instant what he held was a loaded weapon, one capable of destroying reputations, dismantling alliances, and shifting the entire landscape of power at General Hospital. He didn't move quickly. He didn't need to. The letter wasn't a grenade, it was a scalpel. Martin knew better than to swing it wildly. First, he made a copy. Then, with calculated calm, he sought out Drew. Martin had been watching Drew closely in recent weeks, noticing the man's simmering frustration with Tracy. Her meddling in ELQ business, her condescending remarks, her manipulation of people close to Drew had left him more isolated and angry than ever. Martin didn't need to stoke the flames, he only had to offer a spark. During a quiet moment at the Quartermain estate, Martin presented Drew with the letter and a solemn expression. No embellishment, no dramatic speech. He simply handed it over and let Drew read it himself. What happened next was not a surprise. Martin could see the change in Drew's posture as he read, the tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers curled around the page like they wanted to tear it in two. Drew had always prided himself on being a man of principle, of fairness and moral clarity. But what Tracy had done, if what the letter implied was true, was beyond manipulation. It was criminal. And the idea that Monica, someone he still respected deeply, may have been used as an unwitting accomplice, pushed Drew further into the moral gray that Martin had hoped he'd embrace. To Martin, this wasn't just about retribution. It was about reclaiming power. He had spent too long watching Tracy dominate the narrative, watching Lucy fight in vain against a woman who seemed untouchable. Martin wanted to be the one to knock Tracy off her pedestal. Not with a loud scandal, but with the slow, deliberate unraveling of everything she had built her name upon. And if Lucy happened to see it happen, if she happened to witness the mighty Tracy fall and finally understand who had truly been behind the collapse of her foundation, Martin believed it would restore some semblance of dignity to what they had lost. Maybe even make her realize that he had always been on her side. But revenge is rarely clean, and Martin knew that better than anyone. What he hadn't expected was the tangled web of consequences that came with it. As Drew began to quietly investigate the claims in the letter, pulling records, asking questions, others began to notice. Monica, ever perceptive, felt the shift in atmosphere. She noticed the way people whispered after meetings, the way Drew avoided eye contact. And eventually, she confronted Martin. Not with accusations, but with a wary sort of confusion. Why was he suddenly so interested in her past? What did he hope to gain? Martin deflected, of course, but Monica wasn't easily fooled. She began combing through her old files, trying to piece together what might have prompted this quiet war being waged around her. And when she found her own name attached to the patient file Martin had referenced, an old case she had signed off on during a chaotic transition period, her heart sank. She remembered the case only vaguely, the pressure the board had been under at the time, and the way Tracy had insisted the matter be handled internally. Monica had trusted her then. That trust now felt like a noose tightening around her neck. Meanwhile, Tracy began to sense that something was amiss. Her instincts had always been razor-sharp, and when Martin suddenly grew bolder in his public remarks, when Drew stopped returning her calls, and Lucy began making cryptic comments during board meetings, she knew a storm was coming. She launched her own quiet investigation, employing her vast network of allies to track the leak. But she couldn't stop the momentum. The information Martin had seeded was growing like rot beneath her empire, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. And through it all, Martin watched, silent, composed, determined. He didn't need public applause or revenge served in headlines. He needed Tracy to crumble from the inside out. He needed Lucy to know the truth. And he needed to prove to himself that he was no longer the man who had lost everything. He was the man who could take it all back. One move at a time. At the same time that Martin was maneuvering behind the scenes, Monica began to experience a chilling shift in her day-to-day life at the hospital. Once confident in her authority and respected for her decades of service, she now felt as if a shadow had begun to trail her. There was something unsettling in the air, an unspoken tension that followed her from hallway to boardroom. The subtle glances Martin cast her way during staff meetings, the veiled inquiries about hospital history, and the oddly specific questions he asked during discussions about former cases, all of it gnawed at her instincts. At first, Monica brushed it off as Martin being his usual inquisitive self, perhaps trying to assert some newfound relevance. But it soon became impossible to ignore the growing feeling that she was being studied, not respected. That Martin was building something beneath the surface, brick by manipulative brick. She would later realize that the turning point had already passed, the moment she had received the nondescript envelope weeks ago. She had barely noticed it then, just another anonymous letter, placed among a sea of grievances, donor requests, and administrative paperwork. She hadn't even opened it, assuming it was another hospital complaint or a patient family member rehashing long-dead grievances. It was now clear to her that this unopened envelope held something far more dangerous, a dormant threat waiting to be awakened. When she overheard a fragment of a conversation between Martin and Yuri outside one of the conference rooms, the pieces started falling into place. Martin's calm voice, speaking of historical boardroom mistakes and the importance of timing, chilled her to the core. She didn't hear the entire conversation, but it was enough to send her heart pounding with suspicion. As Monica retraced her steps and reviewed recent interactions, she began to suspect that Martin had somehow gotten hold of the letter. The problem was, she no longer knew what exactly it said. And that uncertainty became her greatest fear. She recalled the error referenced by Martin's words, when the board was under pressure, when Tracy had strong-armed several executive decisions, and when Monica herself had signed off on documentation she barely had time to review. She knew that her intentions had always been to preserve the hospital's integrity, but intentions meant little in the court of public opinion, or worse, in the hands of someone who saw weakness as leverage. The revelation placed Monica in an impossible position. On one hand, she felt a deep and enduring loyalty to Tracy, with whom she had shared both fierce rivalries and reluctant alliances throughout the years. On the other, she knew that covering up the truth, if what she feared was true, could not only destroy her reputation but potentially implicate her in something ethically indefensible. Torn between fear and principle, between the past she wanted to forget and the future now at risk, Monica began digging into her old files, desperate to find out what Martin had discovered before it was too late. Meanwhile, the ripples of Martin's calculated campaign began reaching other corners of General Hospital. Tracy, usually composed and self-assured, began to sense the unease spreading through the corridors. Lucy, who had been carefully observing Martin's increasingly confident demeanor, confronted Tracy in private, suspicious that something serious was being kept from her. Their relationship, already tense due to years of rivalry and unresolved history, erupted into outright hostility. Lucy, refusing to be left in the dark, began speaking with retired nurses and administrative staff, quietly gathering her own information. She suspected Tracy of orchestrating something in the past that Martin was now trying to exploit, and Lucy would not sit back and let herself become collateral damage. Tracy, recognizing that the walls were beginning to close in, activated her own network of allies. She dispatched a trusted aide to scour through archived hospital documents, aiming to locate and destroy any trace of the incident Martin might be referencing. She knew there had been risks taken years ago, decisions made in haste to protect the hospital's public image, but she never imagined someone like Martin would come so close to unearthing them. What had once been a battle of pride and politics between Tracy and Lucy was now becoming a battle for survival. With reputations, legacies, and even potential legal consequences hanging in the balance, neither woman could afford to blink. All the while, Martin stood at the center of the storm, his ambition feeding off the chaos. The once overlooked man who had been viewed as Lucy's distraction or Tracy's nuisance had become a force to reckon with. But Martin wasn't satisfied with just pulling strings in the shadows. He wanted the spotlight now, not for recognition, but for validation. He needed everyone who had ever dismissed him to see just how much power he now held. In a bold move, Martin encouraged Drew to call for an emergency board meeting, one not listed on the official schedule, one that would catch everyone off guard. He provided Drew with a carefully curated outline of the meeting's purpose, a public discussion about ethical responsibility, hospital leadership, and past medical board decisions. Drew, still burning with frustration toward Tracy, agreed without hesitation. Monica, blindsided by the announcement, had no time to prepare. She arrived at the meeting expecting routine matters and found herself the target of intense scrutiny. The tone of the questions was pointed, almost accusatory, and as the references to the long-buried patient death began surfacing, Monica's chest tightened with dread. Tracy attempted to shut the conversation down, raising procedural objections and questioning the legality of revisiting old board actions without prior notice. But the tide had already turned. Martin had set the stage too perfectly. He sat back during the meeting, allowing Drew and a few strategically influenced board members to dominate the floor. It was clear to everyone in the room that something bigger was at play, and for once, Tracy couldn't control it. Her usual tactics. Cutting sarcasm, threats of legal reprisal, and superior intellect, fell flat in the face of mounting evidence and growing suspicion. In one calculated act, Martin had managed to turn Drew into his unwitting weapon, Monica into a nervous witness, and Tracy into a cornered adversary. All the while, Lucy watched from the sidelines, unsure whether to be horrified or impressed by the man she once thought she understood. What she saw now was someone far colder, far more strategic than she ever imagined, someone who had weaponized grief, betrayal, and old secrets into a meticulously crafted takedown. The war for General Hospital was no longer about departments, board seats, or medical ethics. It had become a war of personal histories, concealed sins, and the unrelenting thirst for power. And Martin, no longer a supporting player in anyone else's story, had made himself the author of a new chapter. One where he held the pen, and everyone else was at his mercy. Lucy's name, once spoken with mild curiosity or faded affection in the halls of General Hospital, now carried a weight laced with consequence. No longer a bystander nor an irrelevant relic of the hospital's complicated past, she had become a symbolic focal point in a war that had quietly ignited beneath the surface of Port Charles. For Martin, Lucy was never merely a memory or a footnote. She was the original wound, the origin of his spiral into calculated vengeance. Her existence reminded him of everything he had once hoped for and everything he had been robbed of. And so, as his elaborate chess game against Tracy and Monica intensified, Martin did not hesitate to draw Lucy into the center of his plot, not with overt malice, but with weaponized intimacy. Martin knew that invoking Lucy's name in strategic conversations would set tongues wagging. He didn't have to declare his intentions outright. Instead, he allowed suggestions and implications to infect the atmosphere, letting hospital staff speculate freely about Lucy's former role in Foundation scandals, her ties to Monica's tenure on the board, and, most potently, her volatile history with Tracy. Whispers crept like mold through every hallway, infecting not only public perception but Lucy's own sense of reality. Every murmur she overheard, every suspicious glance she caught, deepened her unease. Something had shifted, and it wasn't just professional. It was personal. She could feel it. At first, Lucy fought back the anxiety with her usual bravado, telling herself she was above the petty intrigues of men like Martin. She had survived too many wars, reinvented herself too many times, to be derailed now. But even as she put on a show of defiance, doubt crept in. The subtle manipulations Martin employed weren't merely tactics of revenge, they were intimate reminders of the trust she had once placed in him. And now that trust was being twisted into a noose. She began to see herself not just as a casualty, but as a potential catalyst. What if, without knowing it, she had revealed something to Martin years ago, some comment made in passing during their relationship, some file she left out in carelessness? That led him to this letter, this plan, this obsession. The thought haunted her. She had tried to move on from the past, to redefine herself outside of failed romances and political boardroom battles. But Martin, it seemed, had not. And so, driven by guilt and a flickering instinct to salvage what she could, Lucy approached Drew in the quiet of the evening, hoping she could reach the part of him that still clung to reason. She appealed to his morality, to his wisdom, to his memories of when things were simpler. But the man who stood before her wasn't the Drew she remembered. He was colder now, hardened by Tracy's constant manipulations, fueled by Martin's careful narrative building. In Drew's eyes, Lucy saw the echo of her own disillusionment, only his had been weaponized. Drew listened to Lucy's words with mechanical politeness, but he had already crossed the invisible line separating righteousness from retribution. What had begun as a noble desire to expose corruption had devolved into a personal vendetta wrapped in ethical justification. The letter, once an object of curiosity, had become his holy grail, the proof he needed to validate his hatred, to punish Tracy, to hold Monica accountable. Lucy's intervention came too late. Drew, like Martin, was no longer looking for balance. He was looking for blood. And as these two men, once considered allies or at least morally sound, descended deeper into their warpath, the letter, so deceptively ordinary in appearance, gained an almost mythic status. It had once been a mere artifact of forgotten misconduct, but now it was a blazing torch illuminating the rot hidden behind General Hospital's prestigious walls. It represented the unspoken crimes, the whispered decisions, the moral compromises no one dared revisit. It was the convergence of power, guilt, legacy, and loss. And no one, neither Tracy, Monica, Drew, nor Lucy, could escape its reach. The boundaries between past and present were collapsing. Monica, once resolute in her sense of ethics, now found herself unraveling at the seams. Her sleepless nights were filled with doubt. What had she overlooked all those years ago? Had she, in trying to protect the hospital's reputation, become complicit in a cover-up that would now cost her everything? Her very identity as a healer, a leader, a guardian of GH's integrity, was now on trial. But worse than that was the betrayal she felt, not just from Martin or Drew, but from her own memory, her own certainty that she had always done the right thing. Tracy, meanwhile, had shifted from controlling the narrative to desperately trying to silence it. She issued quiet threats, called in favors, and offered behind-the-scenes bribes to anyone who might know more than they were saying. Her facade remained polished in public, but in private, her hands shook with rage and dread. This wasn't a battle she could fight with clever remarks or manipulation. Martin had uncovered something she thought buried forever, and now she was no longer the puppet master, she was the target. Lucy, trapped between loyalty and survival, faced a reckoning of her own. In attempting to bridge the gap between the factions, she found herself isolated, distrusted, and used. Her efforts to broker peace were interpreted as collusion. Her past love for Martin was now ammunition in Tracy's arsenal. Her prior clashes with Monica were re-examined with new suspicion. Lucy no longer recognized the terrain she was walking on.